A master forces his young slave to play piano to mock her, but her talent leaves him speechless. He thought this was just another way to break her spirit. A twisted power play, staged for the amusement of his guests. But instead, she turned his cruelty into a moment no one would ever forget. This is the story of how a single song shattered his control. The grand halls of the Harrow estate had witnessed decades of decadence, corruption, and cold-blooded control. But tonight, a different kind of cruelty was about to unfold. Master Samuel Harrow stood at the center of the room with the kind of confidence only a man born into power could maintain. His chest was broadened by arrogance, his smile lined with silent malice. Draped in velvet and surrounded by smug applause, he was the hero of his own twisted story. Harrow surveyed the crowd, his wealthy associates, the wives trying to outdress each other, and the slithering sycophants desperate to stay in his good graces. They all laughed at his jokes, admired his tastes, and most of all, they enjoyed the entertainment his wealth afforded them. And tonight, the entertainment was human. Near the edge of the room, almost blending into the shadowed corners, stood a girl named Amara. She was young, no more than 16, yet she already carried the weight of a lifetime in her eyes. Silent, still, obedient. She wore a simple linen dress, slightly torn at the hem, bare feet, calloused hands. But what stood out most was her stillness. It wasn't the stillness of fear, not exactly. It was the stillness of someone who had learned to shrink herself in order to survive. Harrow looked directly at her. A smirk curled. He snapped his fingers, loud, sharp. "Come here, girl." The guests went quiet, not with respect, but curiosity. Harrow's voice always promised a show. And they loved a show. Amara stepped forward, each foot barely making a sound on the marble floor. Her gaze stayed low, but her mind was awake, bracing for whatever command would follow. "You all know," Harrow began, theatrically raising his glass, "that this house has been quiet all week. We need some entertainment." Laughter fluttered around him like vultures. "And wouldn't it be fascinating," he continued, "to enjoy a performance?" His voice had that cutting sharpness, the kind that made every worker within earshot tense up. Then he gestured with dramatic flair toward the center of the room, to the piano. It was a grand thing, a polished instrument of deep mahogany, its surface gleaming under the golden chandelier lights. A Vanderburg original, imported, custom-built, a symbol of wealth, refinement. And in this moment, cruelty. The guests followed his gaze and their laughter stopped. A new sound rippled. Excitement, confusion, anticipation. "You want her to play?" one woman asked, chuckling with disbelief. "Oh, yes," Harrow replied. "She claims she can." His eyes flicked toward Amara, not with curiosity, but challenge. "Let's give her a chance. Let's see if she has any talent." A ripple of smug amusement carried through the room. The pianist slave. What a spectacle! How hilarious! How humiliating! Amara didn't flinch, but something in her face, something deep, shifted like a distant flicker of firelight. She took a slow breath. Her fingers twitched slightly, unconsciously, as if they remembered something her body wasn't supposed to. She walked toward the piano, and the room watched with predatory fascination. Each step echoed her reality. She was property. She had no voice, no freedom. And now, no choice. But none of them knew where those fingers had once been, years ago. Before the chains, before the separation, before she lost the one person who taught her that music was not just sound. Music was a world you could escape into. She reached the bench. She sat. The piano loomed before her like a sleeping beast. Her fingers hovered uncertainly over the keys, not because she didn't know how to play, but because she hadn't touched a piano in years, and because the weight of the moment pressed hard on her chest. Everyone was staring, expecting failure, waiting to laugh. Master Harrow leaned forward and tapped his glass against his palm. "Tick-tock," he taunted. "We're waiting." A chuckle rose, a whisper. "Oh, this is about to be embarrassing." Amara closed her eyes for a breath that felt like a lifetime, and placed her hands gently on the keys. The room went silent. A thick, tense silence. She didn't look at the master, or the guests. She didn't even look at her hands. She just felt. She remembered. The first time she ever pressed a piano key, her mother guiding her hands, small fingers discovering a world beyond words, a world of sound, emotion, freedom. A time before she was separated, sold, robbed of identity. And in that stillness, the very stillness that had once kept her safe, she found power. Not with chains, not with screams, but with music. Her finger pressed the first note, soft, trembling, pure. Then another, and another. A melody began, fragile at first, then blooming like a voice that had been forced silent for too long. The room shifted. Some guests exchanged glances. Others froze entirely. The expected chaos, wrong notes, clumsy rhythm, panicked tapping, never came. Instead, something else, something entirely unexpected, rose from the keys like smoke rising from ash. A piece so soulful, so beautiful, so utterly beyond what any of them had imagined. Master Harrow's smile cracked. His hand lowered, his glass stilled. Because this was not the performance he wanted. This was not humiliation. This was a reclamation. She had turned his trap into her stage, and everything, that silence, that power, was just beginning. What he meant to break her with was about to break him, and he had absolutely no idea what was coming next. The first note drifted into the air like the opening breath of a forgotten prayer. Soft and trembling, it felt too delicate to belong in that room. A room filled with alcohol-soaked arrogance, sharpened social games, and the casual cruelty of the upper class. Amara's fingers lingered on the keys, as if listening to the echo inside the piano's belly. For a single moment, the world around her blurred. The guests, the master, the walls, they all faded. And in their place came something her spirit had not allowed her to feel in years. Freedom. It didn't last long, but it was enough. The second note followed, resolved, rooted, then a third, a fourth. Before anyone in the room could blink, the melody took shape. Fragile at first, then graceful, then blooming with power. The piece was familiar, elegant, laced with sadness and depth, a classical composition requiring skill far beyond what anyone expected from her. It wasn't just that the music was beautiful, it was impossible. No one believed an enslaved girl should know how to touch a piano, let alone command one like this. A gasp cut through the air. A guest in the back straightened, suspicious of his own ears. Another woman froze, her wine glass halfway to her lips, confused by what she was hearing. Their laughter didn't just stop, it died, replaced by something uncertain, silent, uncomfortable. Amara didn't raise her head, didn't look at them. She just played. The melody was hers alone. A truth she had buried deep, until this moment, when the piano became her way back to herself. Each note she played felt like a memory unfolding, like someone reaching through time and taking her hand. She remembered the first time she ever touched a piano. She remembered sitting beside her mother, learning the piece she was now playing. A time before chains, before separation, before being sold. The room around her had no idea what they were listening to. But they were listening anyway. The expected chaos, wrong notes, clumsy rhythm, a childish attempt, never came. Instead, something no one in that room had ever expected began to happen. She was controlling them, just with sound. Master Harrow's face was a portrait of confusion. The smug amusement he wore so easily started to shrink. He had expected disaster, expected to turn her into a joke, to reinforce her worthlessness. But this, This was something he could not explain. "How?" he muttered, barely knowing he'd said it aloud. As the melody deepened, the emotional weight of it began to show. The piece wasn't simply sound. It was story. Her story. The pain and loss buried inside her rose up in every chord. Her hands remained steady, but her shoulders trembled. The music was the only way she could remember without breaking. A guest whispered, "Where did she learn this?" Another leaned forward, eyes narrowed on Harrow. "Did you teach her?" The master didn't answer because he couldn't. He was as shocked as they were, and under that shock was something darker, something dangerous, loss of control. This was his home, his party, his piano, his people, his rules. And yet, in this moment, he was the one being stripped bare. Every note was a reminder that the world he thought he controlled was slipping through his fingers. The song swelled into its emotional peak, a passage of raw sorrow and defiant tenderness. That grief belonged to the girl, but the room was forced to feel it. A woman in the back blinked away tears. A man gripped the arm of his chair. Even the house servants frozen in the doorways couldn't look away. Amara's body trembled, not in fear, but in release. This was the first time she had dared to feel like herself in years. Every note was a whisper of who she used to be. A girl with music in her blood. A girl with a mother who believed in her. But that girl was gone, torn away, replaced by a life of commands and silence, until this moment. The final stretch of the melody came, stunning and sorrowful, a climb so breathtaking it forced the room into complete stillness. The last note rang out, soft and final, like a promise, like a goodbye, and when it faded, there was nothing. No applause, no laughter, not even a whisper. Amara lowered her hands into her lap and sat quietly, her head bowed. She didn't need recognition. She didn't need approval. The music had already given her everything she needed. It had given her back her power. Slowly, Harrow leaned back, stunned into silence. His jaw tightened. His throat worked to find words that weren't there, because for the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. What began as humiliation had become humiliation, but not for her. And this was only the beginning. What he meant to break her with was about to break him, and the worst was still to come. The silence in the room felt heavier than stone. Amara hadn't just played the piano, she had shattered the air with something undeniable. Where moments earlier there was arrogance, now there was uncertainty. Where laughter had curled like smoke in the air, only awe remained. And where the master had once stood tall, now he stood small, whether he understood it or not. A cough broke the stillness. Then the guests began to move, not casually but cautiously, as if they were suddenly aware of the weight of the moment. One woman set her wineglass on the table, her hands trembling. A man who had laughed earlier now stared at Amara with shrunken eyes. Another leaned forward, squinting as if trying to understand who she really was. Who was she? That question hovered in the eyes of everyone in the room. They had all been raised to believe that art was the privilege of the elite, that grace belonged in bloodlines of power, that music came from polished fingers, not calloused ones. But here she was, undoing everything they thought they knew. She played like she had lived in music her entire life. She played like someone who carried symphonies inside her chest. She wasn't supposed to exist, but she did. And shock, real, unnerving shock, had rooted itself deep into the hearts of everyone watching, except for Master Harrow. His shock had already faded. What grew in its place was anger, not obvious, not yet, but simmering beneath his skin like a quiet fire. How dare she? How dare this girl make him look small in his own house? How dare she expose a strength he wasn't ready to acknowledge? He cleared his throat. The spell broke. The guests turned toward him, remembering who they were supposed to respect, who still claimed the power. "Well," Harrow said, voice strained. That was unexpected. He tried to smile, but his lips betrayed him. They twitched, refusing to hide the crack in his composure. The room saw it. The guests felt it. They began to exchange glances. "Did you know she could do that?" one whispered. Harrow's jaw clenched. "No," he replied sharply. And with that single word, the truth rippled through the room. He had never given her permission to be anything beyond what he believed she was worth. He had never known her. Not really. Not like he thought he did. He never saw her as more than what he bought. The guests leaned in, suddenly intrigued in all the wrong ways. How long had she been able to play? Did she learn here? Somewhere else? Harrow didn't answer. Amara remained at the piano, sitting quietly, hands folded in her lap. She did not look at the crowd. She did not react to the sudden awareness of her existence. She just existed. Fully. Without apology. Without permission. And that, in itself, was more powerful than any note she'd played. One of the wives broke the silence. "Play again," she whispered. Harrow's eyes snapped to her. "That will be enough," he said, low and dangerous. But nobody clapped. Nobody laughed. Nobody reassured him. Instead, for the first time since the party began, the room wasn't revolving around him. It was revolving around her. A girl they had never once looked at directly. A girl whose silence they confused for emptiness. A girl whose hands were meant to toil, not create. But now they knew the truth. Her silence had never been emptiness, and her music had never been just notes. The master stood in the center of a room he no longer fully owned, and he didn't even know it yet. The master had lost control for a moment. But the real danger? He was about to lose something even more valuable, and he had no idea who he was dealing with yet. The room hadn't breathed in a full minute, and still she didn't look up. Amara's fingers hovered, then found the keys again, not for spectacle, not for applause, but because the song inside her refused to die. What he didn't know was that the notes she chose now were the map of her life, a thread back through darkness toward a door that had been slammed shut. She began softly, as if speaking to a child, and the melody curled like smoke around the chandelier light. It carried the warmth of a small room long ago, the smell of stew, a mother's hum that made the world feel larger than hunger. Amara's hands told that secret. Once there was belonging. Once there was a name said with tenderness. Once there was music that meant home. The guests leaned forward involuntarily, faces tilting as though they could eavesdrop on a memory. They were hearing something forbidden, the sound of a girl remembering herself. For them, it was art. For her, it was oxygen. But this was just the beginning of his nightmare. The melody turned, almost imperceptibly, from amber to iron. A chord tightened, another pressed harder. The air changed. A door slammed in the harmony. The warmth fractured. She modulated, and in that shift lived the shatter. Hands torn apart, a mother wrenched away. A road that did not end but only disappeared. Her left hand marched with boots she never saw. Her right hand cried like a child into a cloth that wasn't hers. The grand piano became a witness stand, and the room a jury that could not look away. Harrow's throat worked. He felt the accusation without a word spoken. He had ordered a joke. He was standing in a confession. He watched the girl he owned play a history he could not rewrite, and in the music his own name appeared like a stain. The bigger problem wasn't lost customers at his table. It was the dignity he could not crush, rising note by note like a storm over his roof. Amara did not give them violence in sound. She gave them the ache that sits after violence leaves. She gave them the echo of an empty bed, the tremor that stays in a hand for months, the slow, stubborn return of breath when the world insists you have no right to breathe. Each phrase rose, then broke, then rose again. Scar, then courage, then scar again, until even the guests who had come to be entertained sat with their mouths half open, ashamed to swallow. A woman near the mantel pressed a lace handkerchief to her eyes and pretended it was dust. A man who prided himself on taste recognized the structure, the precision, the fearless rubato that only a musician's soul would dare. Another guest glanced at Harrow, measuring his face, finding not leadership but a mask that had begun to crack down the middle. And it wasn't just his composure that was falling apart. Amara shifted the key once more. Upward, braver. Her right hand climbed like a girl who has learned to climb in the dark, counting splinters, memorizing which rung won't break. She braided two themes, the mother's hum and the soldier's march. Grief and grit twined so tightly you could not separate them without bleeding. She did not plead for mercy. She showed them what mercy had cost her and how she had kept one corner of herself from the fire. Then came the most devastating news of all, tucked inside a cascade of arpeggios. The day she chose silence to survive. The melody thinned, threads of melody stretched until nearly breaking. The left hand, barely there. You could hear the empty years between notes, stretched so tight the room's heart thudded against them. But she wasn't done. A single, stubborn tone held, pure as first snow. On that one tone, she built a bridge. Harrow looked away, then back again as if refusing a mirror. He knew rooms like this were supposed to praise him, yet every second she played, the room belonged to her. He could order the servants to move, the band to stop, the doors to close. He could not command this. He could not command awe. He could not command the shame that flickered in his guests' eyes when they glanced at him and saw, not a patron of culture, but a man standing on another human's throat while calling it refinement. Amara's shoulders steadied. The river of notes widened, sunlight touching the water. She brought back the first theme, the small room, the stew, the hum, but changed it, as if to say, "It is not the same, and yet I carry it." She gave the mother a home inside the daughter. She found a second line beneath the first, a counter-melody that sounded like a promise she had made to herself when no one could hear. For her, the bigger problem wasn't the chains on her wrists, it was the chains they wanted around her mind, and the music was the key. A crystalline run climbed the keyboard and hung there, daring gravity. Someone exhaled as if coming up from deep water. Another guest's hand lifted instinctively, the beginning of applause he dared not finish. Even the servants, trained into invisibility, drifted near to doorways like moths to a lantern that might finally be theirs. Harrow's fury thickened, turning iron in his veins. He needed this to stop. He needed control, validation, laughter, anything to reassert the story he had written. But he did not dare interrupt the music, not with all those eyes on him. What he didn't know was that his silence, this new, unfamiliar silence, was already an admission. He had never feared a melody before tonight. Amara pressed into the piano's low end, and thunder rolled out. A dark memory, a warning. For a heartbeat, it sounded like a whip cracking in a canyon. For another, like iron gates closing. The guests flinched without understanding why their bodies knew the sound. But then she surprised them. She dropped the weight, opened the chords, and let a bright, ringing interval cut clean through. It was the sound of a door that should not have opened, and did. She held the high note long enough to make time wobble. Inside that sustained light, she tucked a secret message for herself. You are still here. When she let it go, she did so like someone setting a bird free out of her own hands. The bird did not fly. No, it ascended, as if the ceiling had become sky. The payoff arrived not as thunder, but as clarity. The themes converged and reconciled, not by erasing pain, but by containing it without surrender. She resolved the harmony with a dignity that felt older than her body, older than this house, older than every rule men like Harrow had ever written. She finished not with a flourish but with a benediction, 2 notes, close as breath, tender as forgiveness offered to someone who does not deserve it. Silence fell again, but this time it was not shock. It was recognition. It was the kind of silence people keep at funerals and births, at thresholds where the world is different on the other side. Amara lifted her hands from the keys and placed them in her lap. Her back stayed straight. She did not glance at the door, at the guests, or at the master. She stared at the polished wood and saw, reflected faintly, not a slave, not a child, but a musician who had said everything without a single word. A single clap might have shattered the spell, but no one was brave enough to be first. They were waiting to see what Harrow would do, whether he would drag the room backward into the old rules, or be dragged forward by a truth he could not control. He stood very still, taut as wire, eyes on the girl as if she had committed the most offensive act of all. She had made him feel. His terror dressed itself in pride. His anger disguised itself as order. He opened his mouth to reclaim the night with a quip that would turn this miracle into a footnote, his foot on its throat. But his voice found no footing. He was, for once, exactly what the title promised, speechless. What she didn't know was that his silence was not surrender. It was calculation. And calculation, in a man like him, was a storm that did not announce itself until the windows broke. But this was only the beginning, because the song that freed her spirit had just cornered his pride, and pride like his does not die quietly. The music had ended, but the silence that followed carried more weight than any sound possibly could. It wasn't the silence of admiration. It wasn't the silence of thought. It was the silence of something shattered. Amara hadn't just played the piano. She had revealed a truth none of them were prepared to face. And the man least prepared of all was Master Samuel Harrow. In the space of a single performance, everything he had built, a reputation of control, a persona of refinement and dominance, had been shaken. His pride, thick and unbreakable in his own mind, felt suddenly flimsy. His authority, which he wielded as naturally as breathing, now lay exposed on the cold marble floor. His smile, his weapon of charm, was gone. His voice, the force behind his commands, was caught somewhere in his throat, refusing to cooperate. This wasn't how the night was supposed to go. He replayed the last few minutes over and over, searching for a way to undo what had happened. But every memory was the same. Amara walking to the piano like a shadow, then playing like a storm. Her talent had not made him look powerful. It had made him look blind. She didn't need his voice. She didn't need his permission. Worst of all, she didn't even need his presence to shine. And his guests knew it. The glances they exchanged brought no comfort. He saw in their eyes not the usual mix of awe or agreement, but curiosity, doubt, even something like pity. And that is what truly wounded him. The idea that they might now see him as less aware, less in control, less deserving of their admiration. One man leaned toward another and whispered, "That wasn't just skill. That was something else." The guest beside him nodded, more slowly than before, as if weighing each word. It almost felt like she was speaking. That word hit Harrow like a slap. Speaking. She had spoken through music, told a story he never asked to hear, made them feel something he had no power over. She had stolen the spotlight he thought only he could decide who deserved. A woman at the far end of the room finally asked what others were thinking. How long has she known how to play like that? The question lingered in the air like a challenge, pushing itself closer and closer to Harrow's ears. How long had she been hiding? Or worse, how long had he been too indifferent to even notice? "Did you teach her, Samuel?" another guest asked. "That piece was extraordinary." Harrow clenched his jaw. "No," he snapped. The answer came too quickly, too sharply, and the room noticed. With that one word he exposed what he had never intended to be seen, that he had never given her that gift. She had not learned this from him. She had not been shaped by him. She was something beyond his influence, and that made her dangerous. He could feel something boiling inside him, something darker than anger, a threat, a loss, a terror that the world he built could be undone by someone he never considered worth noticing. He cleared his throat, forcing the sound out into the air like he was trying to reclaim the space around him. "Well," he said, voice brittle, "that will be enough for tonight." But not a single clap came. Not a chuckle, just a thick, eternal pause. It was a subtle, invisible rebellion, but one he felt in his very bones. They weren't listening to him. They weren't obeying without thought. They were waiting, watching, measuring, and none of them were looking at him anymore. They were looking at her. Amara sat still, hands folded, gaze down, but there was something different now. A quiet dignity, a confidence not loud and boastful, but unshakable. She wasn't proud in the way Harrow knew pride. She wasn't triumphant. She wasn't performing. She was simply herself, and that was more powerful than any speech he could have given. Harrow felt a crack inside him, a realization he couldn't name aloud. She has something I can't take from her. And that was unacceptable. As the night lingered into uncomfortable stillness, Harrow's thoughts sharpened like shattered glass. This humiliation could not stand. That performance, as brilliant as it was, had made him look weak, had made him look unaware. And in his world, a master who seems unaware is not a master at all. A dozen petty thoughts flashed through his mind. She needs to learn her place again. She needs to remember it. She needs to understand that one act of rebellion, no matter how beautiful, won't change the reality he controls. Because Harrow did not just value power. He needed it. Without it, he was no one. So he watched her as the guests eventually forced themselves back into shallow conversations. He watched her as she was dismissed to the servants' wing. He watched her walk just like she had earlier, quiet, head low, body small. But now he knew the truth. She was no longer small. She was dangerous. And he would make her pay. Because what she said in that music could not be unsaid. What she revealed could not be buried. And a man like Harrow would rather destroy the truth than live in a world where he could not control it. Because the music may have ended, but the price she would pay for playing it was only just beginning. Amara didn't sleep that night. How could she? Her body lay still, but her spirit was wide awake, haunted by the echoes of the piano keys, replaying every note in the darkness. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the room again. She felt the weight of every stare. She heard the silence swelling around her as her fingers crafted the story she never got to speak aloud. She hadn't just played music that night. She had set something free, a truth that refused to go back into hiding. But for all the power that music gave her, there was something else setting in too. Fear. Not the fear she was used to, the fear of punishment or pain. This was deeper, sharper. It was the fear of being seen, because now she wasn't invisible anymore. Not to the guests, not to the staff, and least of all, not to Master Harrow. She knew exactly what kind of man he was. She had lived under his shadow long enough, and she knew that when a man like Harrow feels his control slipping, he doesn't let it go quietly. The morning came early. Before the sun finished lifting itself into the sky, Amara was summoned to the courtyard. No explanation, no warning, just a command. Bring her. She walked through the estate like a ghost in plain sight, passing other servants who watched her with a mix of worry, curiosity, and sympathy. They didn't say a word. They didn't need to. Everyone felt the shift. Something had changed, and it was only a matter of time before something broke. When Amara reached the courtyard, she saw it instantly, the piano. But not where it belonged, not in the room filled with chandeliers and velvet and gold. It sat alone under the brutal morning light, dragged across stone floors and left exposed. No elegance, no reverence, only the instrument, presented like a body on display. Master Harrow stood beside it, Next to him, a large man held a hammer. Amara stopped in her tracks. Her heartbeat quickened. She felt the cold bite of realization before Harrow even opened his mouth. "Do you know what a piano costs?" he asked calmly without looking at her. "Do you know what it takes to own one?" His voice sharpened. "Of course not. You own nothing." He stepped closer, expression settling into a cold, quiet rage. "But last night, you forgot that, didn't you? You thought the room belonged to you. You thought the music belonged to you." His eyes narrowed into a deadly stillness. "You embarrassed me." She didn't look away. She didn't tremble. But inside, a storm was building. Harrow turned toward the man with the hammer and nodded once. "Do it." The hammer came down in a violent arc. The first impact cracked the polished wood. It sounded like bone breaking. Amara flinched as the second strike split the piano's casing, spraying chips of lacquer and splinters across the stone floor. A third blow crushed a section of keys, breaking ivory and wood into jagged shards that flew like teeth. Each hit was more than destruction. It was humiliation. The man continued, swinging again and again, tearing out the piano's insides, hammers, strings, the soul of the instrument, breaking it apart as if it were nothing more than lumber. Harrow didn't look at the piano. He looked at her. He wasn't trying to hurt the instrument. He was trying to hurt her, because the piano was more than furniture. It was a voice, a memory, a thread connecting her to the girl she used to be, to the mother she once had, to the music she didn't choose, but couldn't let go. And he knew that. That was why he chose this punishment. Not to restrain her body, but to suffocate her spirit. Amara didn't cry. She didn't beg for him to stop. She stood like a monument, silent, unbroken in form, but bleeding beneath the surface. Every shattered key was a heartbeat she lost. Every snapped string was a memory he tried to erase. But she did not bow. The hammer fell one final time. A string snapped violently, coiling in the air like a snake before falling lifelessly to the ground. Silence. Harrow spoke softly, but with icy triumph. "You will remember your place now." He turned and walked away. But he didn't see her eyes. He didn't see what he had failed to break, because in the ruins of that piano something unexpected had risen inside her. Something that had no keys, no strings, no wooden body to destroy. Her music did not live in the instrument. It lived in her. And in that moment, standing before the wreckage, Amara realized something Harrow had never considered. You can break an object, but you cannot break purpose. The music was still inside her, and now, with nothing left to lose, it burned brighter than ever before. Not for applause, not for permission, but for freedom. She had been a girl with music. Now she was becoming a woman with a mission. And that mission was no longer just to survive. It was to rise, to play again, to be heard, not by choice, but by destiny. Because destroying the piano didn't silence her. It ignited her. And the next time she played, it wouldn't be in chains. It would be on her own terms. The night was quieter than it had been in weeks, but inside the walls of the estate something was brewing, an energy that felt like someone holding their breath just before everything changes. While Master Harrow drank with his guests, basking in meaningless toasts and hollow praise, a single figure walked out from the servants' quarters under the cover of darkness. Amara. She wasn't dressed in rags this time. She wasn't covered in soot or carrying buckets or scrubbing floors. Tonight she moved with intention, her steps steady, her eyes clear, a fire burning low and bright in her chest. Because tonight she was leaving, but she wasn't leaving quietly. She carried something in her arms, a violin, not an object she stumbled upon, not something left behind by accident, but a gift, delivered by a man from the outside, a man who had heard rumors of a girl who played Chopin without ever being taught, a man who believed talent was not something to be hidden, but something to be heard. "You're not supposed to stay silent," he told her the night before. "Some voices only grow stronger in captivity." Amara had held on to those words, let them sink into her bones like truth. She was not meant for silence, not anymore. And now, the violin, light, fragile, full of potential, was her truth made real. She stepped into the night, through the back garden, past the rusted gate, past the sleeping guard whose head lolled like a doll's. For the first time in years, she felt the night air as something other than a threat. It felt like freedom. She stopped at the hill overlooking the estate, far enough that no one could reach her in time, close enough that they could still hear her. She closed her eyes and lifted the bow to the strings. Then she played. Not timidly, not quietly, not like someone afraid to wake the dead. She played like someone determined to be heard by the living. 3 notes in, and the world changed. Inside the estate, glasses halted mid-air. Conversations died. Heads turned toward the balcony as the music drifted through the open doors, soft at first, then growing in power like a rising tide. Master Harrow felt it before he understood it. He set his glass down, slowly stood. The color left his face, because he knew that sound. He knew it wasn't coming from inside. It wasn't controlled. It wasn't his. Outside, the violin's voice was raw and real. The notes carried memory and hurt, rising and falling like breath, full of pain, beauty, rebellion. She wasn't playing a piece she had memorized. She was playing her truth, a song that couldn't be taught or contained. The music swept across the grounds, ignoring rules, walls, and ownership. It soaked into the earth, the air, the hearts of those who heard it. A servant paused in the courtyard, hand over her mouth as tears filled her eyes. A young guard leaned forward, captivated, caught between duty and the realization that some things were bigger than obedience. Harrow moved toward the balcony, hands trembling with rage and something deeper. Fear. He stepped outside, looking across the fields, his eyes following the path of the sound. And there she was. Amara, standing on the hill, a dark silhouette against the sky, her body swaying with the music as it poured through her. She wasn't looking at the estate. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She wasn't asking for anything. She was taking her voice back, taking her story back, taking her power back. Her bow climbed the strings, and the melody reached its climax, soaring, fierce, triumphant. You could almost feel the moment she stopped playing for others and started playing for herself. The music was no longer a plea. It was a declaration. The final note landed like a star collapsing, bright, enormous, unforgettable. Amara lowered the violin, and with that she turned her back to the estate and walked forward. Not running, not hiding, just walking, free. The violin cradled against her side like a promise. The music still alive in her blood. Behind her, left in stunned silence, was the man who once believed he owned everything. Now he owned nothing. Not her talent, not her voice, not her story. The master was speechless, because she had played her way into freedom, and he couldn't silence her ever again. Amara walked into the night like it was the first breath she'd ever taken. The air felt sharper. The earth beneath her felt uneven. The world was bigger than she remembered, but far less forgiving. Freedom, she quickly learned, wasn't a path lined with applause. It was a road with no signs, no promises, and no one waiting to catch her if she fell. She walked until her feet throbbed with every step, until the estate was nothing more than a shadow in the distance. But even as the walls behind her grew smaller, the weight of what she'd done grew heavier. She wasn't just a runaway slave. She was a fugitive, a threat, a reminder of everything the world didn't want to face. By dawn, her legs ached like they were made of lead. Hunger roared through her stomach. She found herself in the outskirts of a small town, where no one knew her name or her story, a place where her talent meant nothing if she couldn't eat. She kept her head down, passed through markets, listened as vendors called out their prices, smelled bread baking, watched people move freely through the world as if freedom was air they never even had to ask for. She reached the edge of the marketplace, sat beneath a shuttered window, and held the violin close. Her fingers traced its frame the way one might touch the pulse of something living. She hadn't played since the night she escaped, not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't know if the world wanted her music anymore. But something inside her, something stronger than fear, knew. Music wasn't just expression, it was survival. So she lifted the bow, closed her eyes, and began to play, softly at first, shy, cautious, like waking a voice that had been hurt one too many times. But the sound drew near instantly. People turned, heads tilted. A few stopped walking. A few stepped closer. She didn't see their faces. She didn't need to. All she heard was listening. So she kept going, and the music grew, a melody of exhaustion and hope, of mourning and gratitude, of a soul that had been wounded but refused to disappear. Her bow moved faster. Her fingers flew. The violin vibrated like it was waking up too. Coins began to drop into the open case at her feet, but Amara barely noticed the money. What she felt instead was the world softening, not for her, but because of her song. That was when the boy appeared, barefoot, wide-eyed, grinning like he'd never seen anything so alive. He stood there, frozen, until the song finished. And then, with the kind of directness only a child could manage, he asked, "Where did you learn to play like that?" Amara opened her eyes. She didn't answer. She didn't even know how to begin. She looked down. The violin, her hands, the ground, then up into his expectant gaze. "From someone I can't go back to," she finally whispered. The boy nodded like he understood something bigger than the words themselves. "You sound like fire," he said. She blinked. "Fire?" "Yeah, like music that doesn't just play. It spreads." She almost smiled. Almost. Because that was when she felt it, like a chill crawling up the back of her neck. People were staring at her, too intently. Not with wonder anymore. With recognition. One of the men near the end of the street leaned in and muttered to another, "Isn't that her? The one from the estate?" Amara's body tensed. Her fingers gripped the violin. The boy noticed, too. "You need to go," he whispered, but she didn't move, because running again wasn't the point. Playing was. She lifted the bow again and played louder, because the one thing she feared more than being caught was being silent. What she didn't know was that the boy wasn't the only one who heard her. Someone else watched from a shadowed doorway. Someone who knew what it meant when music didn't just move people, but changed them. And that someone was about to offer her a choice far bigger than escape. The boy didn't leave. Not after the music stopped, not after the men started whispering, not even when the street began to shift uncomfortably, like the air was turning into something dangerous. He waited until the last coin hit the violin case. And then he stepped closer. "My name's Finn," he said quietly, watching her pack the violin away with the tender care of someone folding up something sacred. "If you're trying not to be found, playing in the middle of a market's a bad way to start." Amara didn't look up. "Then why? Didn't you run?" she replied softly. He grinned. "Because you didn't." She paused. Her fingers tightened on the case handle. Finn leaned in, lowered his voice. "I know what it's like, you know. Being watched, being judged, being other." He scratched the back of his head. People don't always hate what they don't understand. Sometimes they're just scared of it. She finally looked at him. The boy was maybe 14, maybe younger, dirt under his nails, torn clothes, a bruise under his eye that hadn't fully healed, but his eyes, those were bright, unbroken. "Do you play?" she asked cautiously. He shrugged. "A little. Not like you." Then his voice dropped. But I know people who do, and they ain't scared of playing loud. That caught her attention. You said you can't go back to who taught you, he said, echoing her earlier words. But what if you didn't have to? He glanced around, cautious now. What if you found a place where nobody cared where you came from, only what you had? She studied him for a long moment, silent, weighing the risk. The truth was, she didn't know where she was supposed to be. And maybe, just maybe, that meant she needed to stop trying to figure it out alone. Come on, he whispered, motioning for her to follow. I'm not dragging you into trouble. I'm showing you where people like us go when the world tries to shut us up. Just then, footsteps. The men who had whispered earlier were now walking closer, eyes sharp, voices circling her like vultures. That's her, the girl from the estate. Finn didn't wait. Now, Amara. Now. Her heart leapt, her instincts screamed. She grabbed the violin case and moved. Through the alley, past the vendors, up the cobblestone stairs, into the shadow of a crumbling wall where the city thinned into wild fields. She didn't stop until Finn did, chest heaving, pointing toward a hidden door behind a broken mill. In there, he gasped. You'll be safe, I promise. She paused, looked back. No one was behind them yet. She turned back to Finn, who waited with something rare in his eyes. Belief. Belief in her. Belief in what she could do. She opened the door. What she didn't know was that the world behind it wasn't just a hiding place. It was a revolution waiting for a voice. And hers was the one they'd been listening for. Because inside that forgotten space was a community of outcasts united by rhythm, by scars, by fire, and they were waiting for someone who could turn music into uprising. And Amara was about to play her second masterpiece. The door creaked open, and Amara stepped into a world completely unlike the one she'd just escaped. The air inside the mill was thick, warm with breath, buzzing with energy, vibrating with the low hum of voices and instruments tuning in the shadows. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting wild golden light on worn wooden floors and stone walls, plastered with handwritten posters. They read things like, "No masters, only music. Your voice is your weapon. Play loud enough to live." She wasn't just in a room. She was in a rebellion. Finn walked in behind her, breathless but grinning. "Told you," he whispered. "Not everyone out here wants you quiet." Someone turned toward them, the one who'd been watching from the back of the market. A woman, tall, sharp-eyed, wrapped in a coat too thin for the cold. Her voice was low, steady. A leader's voice. "You're Amara," she said, not asked. "The girl from the estate." Amara froze. Her fingers brushed against the violin case, instinctively protective. "I heard you," the woman continued. "Out there. Saw what you did. That took more than talent." Amara's pulse raced. They knew her. And yet, there was no threat in the woman's tone, only respect. Quiet, weighted respect. "We don't ask why people show up here," the woman said. "We ask what they need, and what they're willing to give." Amara didn't speak. She didn't know where to begin. Finn nodded toward a stage at the front of the room. Just a wooden platform. Rough, unpolished. But Amara understood immediately. It was a place meant for voices, for truth, for things too dangerous to say in daylight. She swallowed. The violin case felt heavier now. "Play for them," Finn whispered, stepping closer. "Not to prove something, but to belong somewhere." Her chest tightened. Belonging. It was something she hadn't let herself imagine in years. She stepped toward the stage. One slow step at a time. The room quieted. Dozens of eyes watching her, curious, skeptical, hopeful. She opened the case. The violin gleamed under the flickering lanterns. Her fingers found the bow like they were finding home. Then she lifted it and played. Not a performance. An awakening. Her first note was raw, unpolished. But she didn't stop. She pressed forward, eyes closed, hands remembering what it felt like to be both prisoner and free. The melody rose, and the room changed. Breath caught, hearts shifted in chests, heads bowed, eyes overflowed. She played grief, and it was felt. She played rage, and it was feared. She played hope, and it was unstoppable. The rhythm of rebellion filled the air. Voices began to join, soft at first, then louder. Drums were pulled in, feet stomped, hands clapped time. This wasn't music anymore, it was movement. By the time she finished, no one was sitting. The room was alive. They looked at her, not with pity, not with confusion, but with fire in their eyes. Someone in the back shouted, "That's not a song, that's a battle call." Applause erupted, not polite, not grateful, furious applause. Amara stood there, breath shaking, pulse racing. For the first time in her life, she wasn't invisible. She wasn't property. She wasn't silent. She was heard. The woman stepped forward, eyes intense. "You don't just play music," she said. "You make people feel. You make them move." Amara tried to speak, but no words came out. "You're not here to hide," the woman continued. "You're here to lead." And just like that, everything changed, because she didn't just play a song in a broken mill. She played the first note of a revolution. But while music can start a fire, the flames don't stay in one place for long, and word of her performance was already spreading beyond the walls, making its way back to the man who thought he'd broken her for good. And he wasn't done watching her yet. In the days that followed her performance at the mill, the air in the underground community changed, brightened, thickened, sharpened. Amara didn't just become a newcomer. She became a rumor, a name spoken beyond walls and across rooftops. The sound of her violin had spilled beyond the mill that night and bled into the city like ink in water. People were talking. A slave who escaped, a girl who played like she had lived 100 lives, a musician who didn't just perform, she provoked. It wasn't long until stories began to shift, mutate, and ignite the kind of curiosity that spreads faster than truth ever could. The people in power heard, the owners heard, the watchers, the overseers, the people whose entire world depended on keeping voices like Amara's silent, heard. And so did Master Harrow. He learned of it 3 days after her first performance. From a wealthy man in the city, someone who had been at that same party, someone who had smirked with him, drank with him, and now spoke with venomous amusement. "You didn't break her," the man said with a mocking smile. "You unleashed her." It was only a sentence, but it swallowed Harrow whole. He had tried to bury her voice in splintered wood and broken strings, but instead she had turned it into something louder, stronger, far beyond the walls of his estate. She was no longer a secret shame or private burden. She was a symbol, and symbols are harder to destroy. That night, after hours of silent, boiling rage, Harrow reached across his desk and pulled out a small locked drawer. From it, he retrieved a sealed envelope. Dark wax, embossed crest. A seal he never wanted to use unless absolutely necessary. When he opened it, a single card inside glared back at him with cold, unfeeling script. The Order of Retrieval. He hesitated, just for a moment, then he signed his name. The ink spread across the card like a stain on his conscience. The deal was made. The hunters were coming. Not the law, not the city watch, not enforcers of justice. No. These were men who traded in silence, men who specialized in disappearing things, men who didn't care why someone was wanted, only that they were paid to make them not be found again. And now, they were coming for her. Back at the mill, Amara was unaware under the swirl of movement and music around her. Her days were filled with teaching, learning, playing, giving her gift to others, and taking in whatever wisdom they had to offer. Like a musician, she flowed, yet somewhere, deep down, she could feel it. Night was coming for her again. It wasn't just the way people glanced over their shoulders now. It wasn't just the whispers that felt heavier, sharper. It was something in her chest. A tension. A string pulled tight that refused to let go. And she wasn't wrong. Because one evening, as the lanterns dimmed and the last echo of drums faded, Finn burst through the door, panting, eyes wide with alarm. "They're looking for you," he choked out. "Not just anyone. They're trained." Amara froze. The grip around her violin tightened. "Who?" He shook his head, voice shaking. "Men who don't ask questions, only drag back whatever they're sent for." "Why now?" she asked quietly, though she already knew. "Because you played." She felt the truth in that moment like a cold wind in the spine. Music had freed her, but it had also painted a target on her back. The woman from the mill stepped forward, chin firm. "You don't have to run this time. Not alone." Amara looked at her, looked at Finn, looked at the dozens of others who were now staring at her, not with fear, but with readiness. She swallowed the fear climbing her throat. "I won't run," she said slowly. "Not again." Finn's eyes widened. "They're dangerous." "So is silence," she replied. The woman stepped closer. "If you stay, we'll stand with you." It wasn't a promise of safety. It was a promise of unity. And maybe that was enough? Amara looked down at her violin, touched the strings one last time. Finally understood the power of what she held. It wasn't just an instrument. It was a weapon. And Harrow had just declared war. Because the hunters weren't coming to return her, they were coming to erase her. But what Harrow didn't understand was this. A voice that's finally found its song cannot be silenced without a fight. And Amara was ready to play her loudest note yet.